You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 23rd of July, 2024, on Monocle Radio.
US Vice President and presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris prepares for her first campaign rally. Could China be the key to peace in the Middle East? And is the youth vote in the US now there for the taking? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Robin Brandt will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the former British diplomat Kerry Brown about his new book charting the tempestuous 400-year relationship between the UK and China. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, political reporter for Politics Home, and by Robin Brandt, the BBC's former China correspondent. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Nadine, first of all, a change of government at Westminster. The first time in a very long time that's happened. 14 years, in fact.
Actually, I wasn't able to vote when we last had a Labour government.
I was going to say, you probably weren't able to remember it.
No, I was actually at school, so I remember being quite politically engaged as a kid. And,
you surprised me.
Yeah, it's such a surprise. I'm being extremely annoyed that I couldn't vote in that election. So, yeah, it's weird to have a Labour government.
I mean, does it make much of a difference to how things feel, seem, work, operate at Westminster?
I mean, one of the things, it's quite democratising for journalists because everyone's contact book has kind of gone up in smoke because most of the MPs that were A, important and B, like, you know, the bulk of people's contact books have gone either voluntarily or like jumping off a ship before it sunk, or they lost their seats. So there's that element to it. And then there's also just walking around and just seeing loads of people that you don't recognise, and quite a lot of young MPs as well. And you can identify them because their lanyards are different. So I'm kind of looking, is that a staffer? And it's like, nope, it's an MP. The MPs are getting younger every year. Maybe I'm getting older. Maybe that's a sign of my age. But no, it's definitely feels like a new term at school.
So how does it work for somebody in your position? Do you have to furiously invite loads of complete strangers out for coffee and try and get to know them?
Pretty much, or kind of do what I tend to do, which is go to events that are being held by think tanks or summer drinks parties or whatever, and then just kind of around the room, and then you can get it all.
Yourself, basically.
Yeah, but everybody knows it's quite, Westminster's a very transactional place, and I like to think of myself as a journalist who's genuinely interested in the issues that each MP cares about. So I tend to ask them, what's your priorities? And if I'm interested in reporting in that similar area, then we'll go for a coffee. It is kind of like a dance. It's like the Westminster journalism dance in a way.
There seems to be a lot more as well. I mean, I used to work in the lobby as well. A lot more talk at this time round about the process of becoming a member of Parliament, what that's like on a personal level, the logistics, your new working place, your office, how you adapt. And I think this time round for outgoing MPs, there's a longer period of time for them as well. I think they're paid for another 4 months, and there's an allowance of them for another 4 months. There's a lot more talk as well about how they deal with going into the market, how they deal with no longer being an MP in this kind of famously brutal system where literally there's a cut-off. So there's a lot more talk about just what it is as a job and how people deal with going into it and coming out of it, isn't there? Which previously we didn't really have, I don't think.
And just on a subject, Robin, that I know a lot of listeners will be thinking about or perhaps even engaging in, summer holidays, you have yours coming up. Which was the lucky country?
We've got big plans. The 5 of us are off to Sardinia. It's gone a little bit, it's gone slightly awry in the last couple of days, but through a process of negotiation, some of it public, some of it private, we're hoping to get it back on track. I'm locked into school holidays, so it's a big deal.
Well, we will be starting properly in the United States, and unceasingly exciting times for any especially excitable politics enthusiasts resident in Milwaukee. Barely has the Republican National Convention folded its big top, but the city is to be graced by the first major rally by Vice President Kamala Harris since she became the presumptive Democratic nominee for the presidency. We do hope to be joining shortly a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. We have people furiously working on that in the production office right now. But Nadine, first of all, there has been, this has upended the presidential race, Kamala Harris being swapped in for outgoing President Joe Biden. Huge surges in funding and donations, $100 million within 24 hours. And is this the kickstart the Democrats needed, do you think?
I think what you're seeing is a very concerted effort by the Democratic Party to kind of think, right, we've lost time because we're obviously changing our candidate now. We were initially planning it would be Biden. I imagine there's a lot of materials that we haven't seen in preparation of it. Same for the Republicans in terms of their attack ads and everything. They're having to completely pivot, and that's expensive to do.
Hilariously, Donald Trump has been whinging about that almost to the extent of suggesting they might sue the Democratic Party.
Well, you know what's quite funny is on one hand, the Republicans are saying they're not worried. On the other hand, they're still talking about Joe Biden, which demonstrates that they don't really know how to attack him. It looks like Donald Trump actually donated to one of Kamala Harris's campaigns for election once. But anyway, when it comes to the pivot, they need this money. And also, I had a glance at what this Project 2025 thing that Biden and Democrats have been saying that Trump's kind of acolytes have been planning, and it is scary. And I think so. What you're seeing is this kind of pushback of people who now it's clear that the Democratic Party has this candidate. Biden's out. As soon as everyone saw him in that debate in June, I think was it June now? I'm losing track of time because of I think it was last month. As soon as everyone saw that debate, I think it was like, we need a new candidate. Now it's happening. It's all the stops are off. So, yeah, I'm not surprised they're moving as quickly as they are because they've got ground to catch up on. And obviously still need to pick a VP.
We'll come back to that. But, Robin, obviously any political campaign that involves Donald Trump is going to be an ugly one. That is what he does. A campaign between Donald Trump and a woman of colour could get ugly for all sorts of depressingly obvious reasons. It remains to be seen how subtle or otherwise Donald Trump himself will be about that. But how bad could this get?
Well, I think you're right. The choice of a woman candidate and a black woman as well, or a woman of colour, means that we could end up seeing Donald Trump at his most vitriolic, even more so back in the campaign of 4 years ago. And that was horrific in some of the language that was used that we don't need to repeat here. So there's no doubt in my mind that with the selection of Kamala Harris, her candidacy for the Democrats provides the opportunity to create some very clear distinctions and differentiations between her as a candidate, her as a party, and Donald Trump and what his candidacy offers. We can see that on abortion rights. We can see that on race in America. There are various other policy areas where it's very clear where the distinctions could lie, and that makes for a good and proper contest. There was much argument, I think, by some, including James Carville, the very well-known Democrat advisor, for a contested open primary. Give it time, make it a transparent process, make the Democrats democratic. That isn't the way they've gone, and I think that's because of partly what Nadine said. There just frankly isn't time. Although she will buy time now, and she will use President Biden as a shield. She'll be very nice about him initially, but I think she will then get a little bit more negative about him and maybe the kind of the politics that he represents. So she will buy herself time now, but it's very clear. They get to August, they get to Chicago, and then 8-9 weeks before the election? That's a very intense campaigning period.
Nadine, in an ideal world, this is not something that Vice President Harris or anybody in her position should have to think about, but this is the world we live in. She will have to think about it. We are going to hear not just a chorus of misogynist and racist dog whistles. This will be misogynist and racist air horns, fireworks, and a fly past. How should she respond to that? Because again, it isn't fair and it isn't right that you dig yourself into an even deeper hole, arguably, if you take it on, confront it and shout it down. But what do you do if you're her?
Well, I saw a clip of Kamala Harris being asked not long ago about whether or not she thought Donald Trump was racist. And she was very transparent and said, well, yes, I do think he's racist because of what he said about Mexicans, because of what he said about the Charlottesville rally, about there being good people on both sides when one of the sides were literal neo-Nazis. So I think you'll see Kamala Harris approach it from a very strong perspective. You don't get to where she's got without knowing how to deal with this sort of stuff.
Well, indeed not.
She was a prosecutor, she was Attorney General, she's Vice President, Attorney General of California, I think it was, and now she's Vice President. So she'll be ready for it. Obviously, the level of unhinged attacks we can expect from Trump, I don't think there's a limit to them. I think as I expect, I actually think Kamala Harris is going to win this. I think if the polls narrow, which they probably will, I think there's like 2 points on a recent poll between the two of them, with Trump just ahead. I think the attacks will become a bit more unhinged. His VP has said some very strange things. I've seen an advert where he said, do you hate Mexicans? Are you a racist? Is that what people are? And just odd approach. So I think she's ready for it.
Well, Senator Vance has opened up another exciting avenue there, which is to hammer her for not having children of her own, which is another fun angle they can exploit.
But I imagine she's heard it all before. I think she'll probably stick to her guns, stick to the method she's had before, and make sure, most of all, that she has a good team and supportive team around her.
I think just one other thing to add as well, having a candidate who is a woman of colour means that race in America, that most divisive of issues, will become important, even more important in this campaign. But what was fascinating, and was one of the illustrations of how poor the Biden campaign was, that you were struggling to find both young people under 40 who supported him, and also, in the Carolinas in particular, in some of those primaries early on, you've struggled to find support, what you'd expect to be traditional support, among black American voters for Biden. That now clearly is not an issue, and Kamala Harris ascending to the candidacy will change that narrative completely for them.
I think part of that was as well because Biden's quite gaffe prone. I think he said things like, you're not really black if you don't vote for me. I think I'm paraphrasing, but he used kind of language like that, and I think the gaffe proneness and the age of Biden unfortunately kind of meant that while I actually think he's probably a pretty good ally, and I think he's for black people in America, there were times when it just came across as a bit patronising and a bit kind of, there are black people that vote for Trump. You may not understand them, but they exist, and they're no less black than a black Democratic voter. But I do think, Kamala Harris being Asian Jamaican, of Asian Jamaican heritage, and all of that sort of stuff will probably, and also younger and more relatable. There's a reason why this kind of Charlie XCX brat stuff has gone viral. She's quite funny.
We'll be coming back to that.
Yeah, I do think that will do her well, because at the moment she's definitely winning the war on social media. Obviously algorithms and everything, but she's got a big fan base at the moment on social media.
Just finally and quickly on this one, Robin, before we move on to other things, you mentioned earlier that one challenge that does now await her is picking an appropriate vice president. A conventional wisdom has descended that this basically has to be the whitest male she can find. But is that necessarily the case, do you think? Do you honestly, there is no earthly reason why you shouldn't put two women on a presidential ticket. But is the United States maybe not ready for that? Or, as has been suggested, a woman and a gay man, i.e. Pete Buttigieg?
Look, I think the considerations for her are twofold, and we're seeing more swaying towards the kind of bring a swing state with you, if we believe some of the reporting from the AP and the New York Times today. She seems to be looking at governors or senators in Pennsylvania, Ohio or Kentucky, all key states, Arizona as well, all key states. The other thinking, of course, is Joe Biden's selection by Barack Obama back in 2008. That is to bring kind of gravitas and to bring foreign policy experience with you. Now, Kamala Harris, as brilliant as a prosecutor as she was in California, and as much experience as she's had over the last few years as a vice president, she doesn't really bring a huge amount of foreign policy experience. Now, look, US elections aren't won on foreign policy experience, but we've got Russia, the future of NATO, the war in Ukraine. That would be important. But it looks like she's heading towards some kind of bringing a swing state with her come election day on the 5th.
Well, in Europe, meanwhile, it was always likely that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán would make the most of Hungary's 6-month stint as President of the European Council, and so it has proved. Orbán, endowing himself with the mantle of peacemaker in Ukraine, not that anybody asked him, swanned off to Moscow and Beijing, prompting considerable conniptions in most European capitals. By way of retribution, an informal meeting of EU foreign ministers scheduled for August in Budapest will now occur in Brussels. So there. Nadine, this seems to be driven by the EU's High Representative Josep Borrell. Is this constructive, or is this just descending to Orbán's level?
The thing is with diplomacy, either way you could argue that you can see one side and the other. With Orbán, I think he's just a bit of a strange inclusion in the European family of countries. I always find it strange, I think even when Keir Starmer was, welcoming everybody last week at the Blenheim Palace, and I saw a picture of him shaking Orban's hand. It's just always odd. He's kind of like the odd sibling. So it's not a huge surprise. But listen, obviously there's a lot of frustration with his behaviour within the EU, and I don't really think it's going to amount to anything. It kind of just feels like shade being thrown within a family. That kind of but obviously they're tolerating him, and they continue to tolerate him. He's got some pretty horrendous political views. He said some pretty horrendous things, and he continues to be at all of these important summits and around the table. So it doesn't really mean anything. It just feels like a bit of a family spat.
Is it a mistake, though, do you think, Robin, to just keep reacting to him? His whole shtick relies on that. He's always
oxygen. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he is basically the diplomatic equivalent of that little bloke going around the pub pushing people's pints over.
Yeah. I mean, but when he's in your family, and every however many 14, 15 years they get 6 months to wave the flag and bring to the forefront what they think is important. I mean, it's interesting because you've had that history of tensions between the centre, which in this case is Brussels, and member capitals, haven't we? Usually it's over budgets, isn't it? Or usually it's over debt.
Well, for a long time it was between Brussels and London, obviously.
Over rebates. I mean, now we're seeing it over far more kind of concerning ideological differences, I think. I think the relationship with Russia is one thing. The relationship with China is actually slightly more troubling because that is probably to be of far more long-term significance. And what China tries to do is pick off bilateral relationships, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Hungary, whether it's smaller groups of nations. And it's effectively done that with Hungary. And so I suspect there are some in Brussels who see that as being more agitating. I mean, the bigger issue here as well is we talk about Orban, but we also look at Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Is the shift towards the right in EU elections recently? Although we've seen kind of dramatic attempts to deal with that in France and Emmanuel Macron. The UK, of course, are not in the EU anymore. We're in a bit of an aberration, aren't we, in terms of where our politics seems to be going? But I think the bigger concern here is that Orban represents a kind of shift to the right, with attempts to set up that new grouping in the European Parliament. That is also something that they see as institutionally concerning. It gives those groupings in Austria and Hungary more legitimacy and possibly more power. Because
Orban, I think, has understood, Nardine, I am just extemporising theories on the hoof here, that he does have, for all that he is the Prime Minister of a small country, roughly the size of London, really, this is basically like Sadiq Khan trying to shove the European Union around. But he does have a certain power. Because of that, someone like Giorgia Meloni, whatever her tensions with the EU as an idea may be, I think recognises that I am the Prime Minister of actually quite a serious and important country. There's a limit, to how far I can throw my toys out of my pram. Though that said, the United Kingdom did that for years, so I'm undercutting myself as I go along.
Then jumped out the pram.
But it is hard to know what to do about him, because there is such a largely cosy consensus within the rest of the EU. If you strike out from that even slightly, you're on television all the time. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a bit of Erdogan in Turkey with NATO. Like, it's a similar kind of tactic, like complain, moan, do things that are going to frustrate other members and get airtime. It's probably, I'm not well versed in the domestic politics of Hungary, so I don't really know how it plays with his audience. But obviously, he seems to have been leading that country for quite a while now. So clearly he has got a supportive base there. So, in many ways, it's quite inconsequential what he does. It doesn't seem to have any significant impact on general EU policy. So I think it's got more to do with his own ego and ambitions, maybe domestically than internationally. The same goes with Erdogan. He particularly with when the war with Ukraine kicked off initially, he constantly caused headaches for NATO. But again, it was more about him getting attention and airtime rather than anything really substantially changing in NATO. Well, elsewhere in peacemaking outreach, China appears to have taken it upon itself to have a lash at peace in the Middle East, and why not? How hard can it be, etc. During a Wingding convened in Beijing, rival Palestinian factions Hamas and Fatah have signed a joint declaration agreeing to form what is grandly entitled a national reconciliation government for Gaza and the West Bank, though given what has become of several previous such compacts, the holding of breath breath in anticipation of concrete results would be ill-advised. 12 other lesser Palestinian groups, who may just have enjoyed the weekend away, also signed on the dotted. Robin, veteran China correspondent and China observer as you are, does this surprise you? Why is China getting into this?
It doesn't surprise me, but I think it's odd, and maybe we'll come back to this in a bit. It's odd because it essentially is intervention in internal affairs. That's a red line for China when it comes to its own affairs, and yet here China is, I think, on the face of it, intervening, albeit positively, it would say, in Palestinian affairs, but also maybe even those of Israel. So that's odd. Of course, Hamas and Fatah...
Israel is certainly choosing to see it like that.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas and Fatah still have diametrically opposed views on how they want to deal with Israel in the future. So in terms of the credibility of this deal, that seems to be one gaping hole. Does it surprise me? No, it doesn't. And here's why. Last year, we had China bringing together Saudi Arabia and Iran with a similar kind of arrangement, a rapprochement. I mean, they are both key strategic allies for China. Iran gives it oil, Saudi as well. And China wanted to try and develop this burgeoning role of a peacemaker in the Middle East. So there was that last year. There's Hamas and Fatah now. Why does it do it? Well, because it sees an area of the world which is very destabilising. It wants to stop that, but also sees an area of the world at a time when the US is strategically weak. And so it believes it can have a role to play to rival that of the United States. And also this is part of a broader effort to try and push China's agenda of an alternate global governance structure, an alternate global order, maybe. And this is part of demonstrating that alternative. So that's why I think China continues to try and facilitate these moments and try and have these set-piece moments.
I mean, if we're trying to be optimistic about this, Nadine, and just for fun, why not? Is it possible China could be able to accomplish something in the Middle East where power brokers like the United States and the United Kingdom cannot? Because both, to put it mildly, have something of a history in the region. And as soon as the United Kingdom and or the United States tries to involve themselves in the Middle East, everybody just sort of whips out of their inside pocket their furled up folio of historical grievances, which descends to the floor and rolls down the stairs, etc., etc. Whereas China has not really done all that much historically to annoy anybody in the vicinity.
You could say that, but fundamentally Israel's a very close ally of America, and if America's unhappy with who Israel's cozying up to in terms of like peace deals, and that's not going to work well in terms of Israel's national security because it relies so heavily on America. And of course, we've seen this kind of third-party, uninvolved attempts from countries like Qatar who have sent in negotiators. I mean, obviously, they're also housing people from Hamas, but we have seen this attempt to try and have a mediator, third-party mediator who hasn't been involved in the colonisation or partitioning up of the land, and it doesn't work. I'm quite pessimistic about the situation in Israel-Palestine at the moment. I think peace has been pushed back. This war is unlike any one we've seen with, particularly in Gaza, that we've seen before since since Israel's founding. And I think it's going to take decades just for the memory and the kind of people to come to terms with what had happened before they can even start getting around a table. I think it's that severe what we've seen in Gaza. So I'm not that optimistic. But again, I think this is more to do with China's ambitions on the world stage. America's used to being the world's policeman. China would probably love to be the world's policeman. I think you're starting to see this kind of jockeying for, we are the people that go around the world and try and rain democracy down upon people. Obviously, China's not very democratic.
Not so much democracy.
I think just one other thing to kind of point to. Historically, China has very good relationships with the Palestinian people, but also with Israel, the state of Israel. I mean, where I lived in Shanghai, there were tens of thousands of Jews who fled Germany and Europe in the early 30s. Many of them came to Shanghai, and many of them came to China, and China gave refuge to those people. So, China has a historical link with Israel, as strategically important diplomatic associations as well. But it's important to remember, actually, in this instance, China does have good relationships with both sides.
Just finally and quickly on this one, Nadine, and this is not so much about China's involvement, but the agreement or alleged agreement between Hamas and Fatah. Is it untowardly cynical to suspect that what is going on here is that Hamas have signed this because Hamas are still determined to prove that they actually exist and do have power, and Fatah are just thinking, you guys are absolutely finished, sure, whatever, we'll sign this and wait you out?
Yeah, probably. I mean, that is probably a lot of what is behind it. Also, it's a bit of a fingers up to people like America, who many people feel have kind of left the Palestinians, haven't really done enough advocacy on behalf of the Palestinians in this conflict, which, I think given the scenes we're seeing in Gaza, that's not a huge stretch. So no, I think that's probably the thinking of Fatah. I don't think we're going to see some kind of utopia of these two coming together and everything being fine and all the people that were assassinated, it's just all fine now. No, I don't think that we're going to see that.
Well, we will return now to the subject of US Vice President Kamala Harris. It says here that she has been endorsed by an entity trading as Charlie XCX. It feels significant that this is Charlie without an E, and yes, this is your host troweling on the bewildered High Court judge shtick for hilarious comic effect. Online Kamala Harris enthusiasts and indeed the Vice President's own staff have been making a motif of conflating the fledgling Harris campaign with Ms. XCX's current album Brat, and this, from that, is 360.
Yeah, 360. When you're in the mirror, do you like what you see? When you're in the mirror, you're just looking at me.
That was Kamala Harris enthusiast Charlie XCX with 360. Nadine, here as usual, speaking on behalf of the youth of the world. What on earth is going on here?
I think what you'll see, I honestly think this is an example of how young millennials, or zillennials as I like to call myself, and Gen Z are now becoming comms officers and in charge of kind of comms departments, and therefore you're starting to see a different type of online campaigning, and I think it's smart. Kamala Harris's campaign has obviously made the judgment that they're going to kind of tap into the zeitgeist, and this is it at the moment. And ultimately, a 60, 70-year-old is not going to be on TikTok and Instagram or Twitter, although I feel like there are a lot of angry boomers on Twitter, but you're not going to see
there are a lot of angry boomers on Twitter.
But they're clearly playing to a specific base. They're aware of where the future of elections is going. The demographics who aren't as on the internet as much aren't as significant as they used to be. The younger demographics are, and as I said, I think as people my age and younger come through in these press departments, you're seeing increasingly even like memes being posted from government accounts and things like that. Like, this is how my generation and people younger than me communicate, and therefore it makes sense that politicians are pivoting towards that. And I think Kamala Harris also has a kind of youthy vibe about her, and I feel like she probably find it quite fun. And it's also stark contrast if you contrast that to Donald Trump, who now Joe Biden's out of the race, does actually feel quite old in comparison to Kamala Harris. You've got a candidate who has got Charlie XCX and Brat and all this sort of stuff and this kind of young energy, and then you've got...
Trump has got Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan, in fairness.
But again, that just feels a bit not really with the zeitgeist, and it does there is starting to feel like it's kind of... Fundamentally, Trump is a ranting kind of old man who looks weirdly younger than he is, but is really an anti-old man. And he's like a granddad who's quite bigoted and just rants and rants and rants. But because he's rich and looks a bit younger, people forget that. And I think this just reminds me of the differences between Kamala Harris and Trump. I think the zeitgeist that each of them are trying to tap into.
Robin, nevertheless, can she or should she take the youth vote for granted? Because granted, she does seem a great deal younger than Joe Biden, but then who doesn't? But she's 20 years older than the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party. She's 59. There was a dispute upstairs earlier as to whether she technically qualifies as early Gen X or late Boomer.
Well, I think it's fascinating, and Nadine, you're so right. That dynamic on who's the older candidate here has just switched within seconds, didn't it? And it's fascinating. I mean, I think there's a couple of things going on here. I mean, look, when I used to work at a competing radio station as one of the reporters, and the people listening to me were often a lot younger than me, and there was a bit of a fallacy that we had to try and be like them. And my boss said, don't be like them. You need to. They don't want you to be like the audience. They want you to be an authority figure, but they want you to get them, want you to understand them. And I think that's partly what's going on here. Kamala's not trying to be Charlie XCX. She's trying to say, but I get you. And I'm relatable in that way. The other thing is, what's the politics driving it in terms of potential voters? Partly it's to get the vote out, and young Democrat campaigners and young voters are going to be absolutely crucial. And we've seen kind of quite big demographic changes post-COVID, haven't we? So we're not quite clear exactly where those voters potentially are. They used to be in the cities, perhaps they're not so much now. The other thing is, we read consistently that some of the key swing voters, and elections are all about swing voters, remember, are relatively young, 30, 40-year-old women. And in this case, they are either going to be people who know of Charlie XCX because their kids are into it, or they're into it themselves. And this kind of campaigning and this type of comms plays into that.
Just finally on this, Nadine, and going back to what you were saying about comms and what it means when a younger generation comes up and starts doing it, what I kind of hope that they are telling older politicians is engage with popular culture by all means, but engage with the popular culture that means something to you. Because there has been a clip doing the rounds, which I'm sure you've seen, of Kamala Harris, enthusing really knowledgeably and guilelessly and clearly genuinely about, classic 70s funk, Parliament, George Clinton, etc. It's clearly music she really enjoys, and she talks about it with genuine excitement. They get into trouble, don't they, when they start pretending to like things they don't, like, famously Gordon Brown. I mean, the idea that he had the vaguest idea who the Arctic Monkeys even were was preposterous, never mind that, he actually listened to them.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing in terms of this brat Charlie XCX thing, though, as well, is in many ways Charlie XCX, a lot of my friends who are queer are a big fan of her. She represents a kind of a generation of people who are used to having a lot of social freedoms, be that freedom to love who you want to be, freedom to express your gender, freedom to be queer, whatever that means, freedom to be black, freedom to be Asian, whatever. And I think that in many ways does align with what Kamala Harris has done in the past. I mean, I saw a video circulating today about when gay marriage was legalised in California, and she was on the phone waiting to tell them, as Attorney General, right, you can now officiate it, because she was so excited. She visibly looked excited about it. So I think as much as maybe she's not, a brat fan in terms of Charlie XCX, I'm not going to lie, I've heard more Charlie XCX this week than I have my entire life. But I think it's more about Charlie XCX represents a kind of the youth of today in terms of the diversity of it and the voter base that the Democrats are, aiming for. Because lest we forget, people like Joe Biden have been so outspoken on trans rights, on gay marriage, and all of these things, more so than in the UK, I would say, from any of our candidates. Keir Starmer, if we heard Keir Starmer saying some of the stuff that Joe Biden had said about trans people, I think our newspapers' heads would explode. So the kind of the culture and the America that Kamala Harris represents, in a weird way, is reflected by this brat. And one last thing I will say is that I was reading about what brat actually is, and I think Charlie XCX was saying, it's about wearing a vest top without a bra and all of this, just being free and being yourself. And I think that is the vibe that they're trying to kind of give. And I think that's what will bring young people out, if you want, honestly, particularly after Biden and Trump. And
just finally, Robin, I will, this is a prejudice of mine that I'm just seeking confirmation of. Just once, what I would like to see is a politician of a certain age, somewhere between Gordon Brown and Joe Biden, for example, when asked about some popular culture thing, just sincerely and honestly reply, no shade on people who are enjoying it, I have never heard of them.
Yeah, you want authenticity, don't you?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're touching on as well, isn't it? Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, whatever you thought about his politics, there's no doubt that you felt he was authentically trying to convey to you what he was about. I think that's what you're getting to, isn't it?
It didn't work out brilliantly for him. It's a mixed blessing.
But Trump has done the same thing with authenticity. I mean, no one can deny that man is not authentic. It's just the authenticity is just a very terrible man. But he's been very authentic throughout his political career. Okay, so where we've got to is authenticity's terrible, fake, lie, and just radiate insincerity in every aspect of your public discourse. On that upbeat note, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Robin Brandt, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the United Kingdom has a mixed relationship with much of the planet, the consequence of spending several centuries trying to teach much of the planet to play cricket at gunpoint. Few Anglo-hyphen relationships are more mixed, however, than its relationship with China, which Britain once approached as overlord, now supplicant. That trajectory is charted in The Great Reversal, Britain, China and the 400-year Contest for Power, by Kerry Brown, director of the Lao China Institute and Professor of Chinese Studies, King's College London, and former First Secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing. I spoke to Kerry earlier and began by asking where his fascination with China, now more than 20 books deep, had begun.
I was living in Japan about 30 years ago as a teacher, and by accident I went to China for about a week and really fell in love with the place. I mean, just its culture and the fact that it was very, very different, but somewhere I could relate to. And so from that point, I decided to learn Chinese. I came back to Britain, learnt Chinese, and then went to live in China for 2 years in the mid-90s. And from that accidental beginning, I've spent much of the rest of my life dealing with the place.
Why has it taken this long then to get around to the book about Great Britain's relationship with China, which is obviously, as we will get into, a fairly up and down, to say the very least, kind of relationship? Were you just sort of putting it off because you thought it would be a difficult one to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we all know this story sort of piecemeal, by the way. I mean, we kind of know bits and pieces of it, the Opium Wars and things like this. And so I assumed I did know the history. And yet when I began to research this book, I realized I didn't. And actually, there is a narrative. It goes back 4.5 centuries, long before the Opium Wars in the early 19th century. Britain and China were aware of each other and trading with each other. And so it really was just getting beyond that assumption that I knew to an acceptance that I didn't know, and that I needed to do something about that. And that's why I wrote the book.
I mean, those stories, I think, are always among the most fun to report or write, those ones where you realise that you're writing a different story to the one you thought you were going to be writing. Was there anything in particular that struck you as surprising or something that you hadn't thought of or been taught before?
Yes, just how collaborative most of the relationship between Britain and China has been over the centuries. We often think of conflict, war, disagreement, most of the time, either in trading, through learning from each other, through British people learning about China and Chinese culture, or Chinese people coming here as students latterly. It's been a collaborative relationship, much more than people might expect. And that was something that really surprised me.
How popular do you expect that analysis to be in China? Because obviously China makes something of a recurring point of the historical grievance it harbours against the United Kingdom, which it tends to portray as fairly straightforward imperial pillaging.
Well, it's funny you say that. I gave a copy to a senior Chinese diplomat of the book recently, and he pointed at the word power in the title and just said, not power, friendship. So I think it sort of might be more popular as a message than you'd expect. I think Chinese people do see the relationship as one in the end, which has become more about friendship than you might suspect. It's at a political level that it's different and difficult, and that's always been the case and will probably go on being the case. But people-to-people contact has always been pretty positive.
I mean, do you think then, and you would be better placed to know this than most people, that China's habitual resort to grievance when conducting diplomacy, is that actually genuinely, viscerally felt, or are they kind of putting on a show there?
I think in a very abstract way, if you ask Chinese officials particularly, do they feel a sense of grievance about the way they were treated in modern history? They would say yes, they felt that they were treated unfairly. But if you're talking about specifics and specific parts of that history, the way in which Britain did have a positive role sometimes in China and its modernization, and how China's modernization would not have had the same pathway that it has without Britain's role from the 19th century onwards, I think they would probably embrace that and accept it. Britain built the first train lines in China. Britain was involved in mining in China and introducing technology about that, and finance. HSBC and others were set up introducing kind of finance ideas in China. So, although it may have been problematic sometimes at the beginning, that influence was real. And a lot of it was not maybe completely positive, but certainly contributed to China's modernization.
This isn't a spoiler, I don't think, but is there a particular point at which the great reversal of your title occurs and China becomes, I guess, the senior partner in this relationship?
Yeah, I think the characteristic of the relationship for much of the 400 plus years I write about is that Britain militarily, economically, and other ways is stronger. I mean, that's just a fact. But in 2005, actually, the Chinese economy became bigger than the British economy. So quite recently, surprisingly recently, and now it's about 4 times the size of the British economy. So that alone shows the sort of big changes and transformations where it's China now which has greater capacity and power. And as I say in the book, there are 3 or 4 other areas where that's true. I think British mindset about China sometimes is a little bit nostalgic and, they're still, a kind of small economy and a bit marginal. No, these days China is on most areas got greater capacity and greater size than Britain has.
Do you think British policymakers have fully grasped that, though? Because obviously towards the end of your book, you get into the relationship as it has gone on since that great reversal took place earlier this century. We did have what was advertised early in David Cameron's tenure as Prime Minister, what was going to be a golden age of relations between the United Kingdom and China. Was that hopeless naivety on Britain's part?
I don't think it was hopeless naivety. I mean, I think we have been trying to have a new framework, a new narrative with China, which is not so negative. But for a while, the handback of Hong Kong in 1997 marked a period of engagement where the Blair government talked about us being trade partners, doing more in terms of trade. And the golden era really was an extension of that. Now we're in a very different era, which is geopolitically much more vexed, and America casts its shadow over that with its very difficult relations with China. But I think Britain needs a China story. It's part of our identity. It's part of our history, as I show in the book.
But do you think, just in closing, that the relationship now, or the relationship as may be improved upon to that extent by David Lammy and the new government perhaps, is that as good as it can reasonably get for China and the United Kingdom in the modern age? Is there any imaginable way at which they would ever really think of each other as allies?
No. I mean, I think we have such different security considerations. At the moment, Russia, Ukraine, we're on different sides of the problem. Britain's relationship with America is very close, and of course China and America have a very difficult relationship, and that's unlikely to change as they compete for global dominance or prominence. So I don't think that we will be allies. However, in areas like combating global warming or artificial intelligence and dealing with the risks from that, nuclear proliferation even up to a point, we can certainly have a close alliance, particularly on global warming, where China is producing technology and actually acknowledges that this is a massive problem. On the whole, in recent years, Britain and China's dialogue there has been pretty fruitful.
That was Kerry Brown. His new book, The Great Reversal, Britain, China and the 400-Year Contest for Power, is available now and very much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Robin Brandt. Today's show was produced by Henry Ree Sheridan, researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Tamsin Howard. Playing us out, The Four Tops, in honour of Duke Fakir, last surviving member of the original lineup, who has died at the age of 88. The Four Tops peaked in the late 1960s, along with the label established in and named for their home city of Detroit, Motown. Fakir, who only retired from the stage earlier this year, took the tenor parts in the chorus behind lead Four Tops vocalist, the throaty baritone Levi Stubbs, and never to better effect than on this Holland Dozier Holland composition, which became the Four Tops signature and remains an imperishable masterpiece of American pop. I'm Andrew Mullett here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.